So I'm delighted to welcome onto the stage. We have Sapna Agrawal, who is Director of Modernisation and Reform at the Cabinet Office here in the UK. Then I have Kok Ping Soon, who is the Chief Executive Officer for at the Government Technology Agency in Singapore. Singapore doing some fantastic things on public service delivery. And then we have Gina Gill, who is the Chief Digital and Information Officer, also here in the UK at the Ministry of Justice. So I'm going to start off this conversation with a very simple question to all of you. We've obviously had the first kind of keynote speeches now, so you've heard what was said there. But in your opinion, what makes an organisation innovative? And Sapna, I'm going to come to you first.
Great, thank you, and thank you for having me. Well, I suppose it's always difficult to sort of define what we mean by innovation, but simply put, in my mind, it is an environment that has the right pillars in place to encourage and support experimentation. And then second, having a ruthless focus on the customer. So understanding your customer, tracking your customer, and willing to be responsive to their needs.
Okay, thanks. Ping Soon, would you agree with that? Or
I wouldn't build on it. You say it's a simple question. It's not a simple question. There are thousands of books being written on it. And it's more like $1 million question. I don't think we have cracked it, but if I could just build on what Sapna has said, I suppose innovation at an individual can probably happen at certain moments of serendipity. But for organizational innovation, I think discipline and commitment is needed. And I would just add on the points to say there are 3 broad ingredients. I think leadership, process, and resources. Yeah. So the leadership, I think we could ask ourselves, are leaders setting innovation as an agenda, the leadership agenda? And it's not just about putting it on an agenda. I think leadership and innovation that happens in an unbounded way will not work. So actually, are you providing a more thematic guide? So leadership is important. Are you creating the culture, right, where you're open to ideas? When ideas come to you, you don't shoot it down. Where you're willing to take risks, even though the hypothesis hasn't been tested. And more importantly, when things fail, do you victimize and stigma the people who do that? So leadership is important. The second thing ingredients that's important, I think, is the process. As I said, it has to be discipline, which means you've got to anchor the organization on a set of processes that you follow through and equip people with that process. So in GovTech, there are many frameworks around, and we kind of landed on the design thinking practice, which I'm sure many in the rooms are quite familiar. So for those who are familiar, we talk about the 5 stages, right? You know, the empathize, right? How you empathize, how you define, the ideation, the prototype, and the test. And each of these has tools and competencies that you have to develop. And finally, the resources. In terms of resources, I think money comes to mind, but I always feel that it's just beyond the money. It's about making available time for the people who are doing innovation and the subjects of the innovation to make available time for them to participate in some of these areas. Yeah.
Really interesting. Before I come to you, Gina, I just want to quickly throw that back to the audience in terms of, you said the culture, giving people space to innovate, but also making them feel like they can fail. Mm-hmm. Honestly, from the audience, could you put your hand up if you think that is the culture in which we work? Do you feel like you are able to test things and fail and have no consequences of failure?
More hands?
And I'm looking up there as well, for hands up there. Okay, so I would say that's not an overwhelming endorsement at the moment, that we've got it quite right. Gina, your sense of what makes an organisation innovative, and also maybe a response to that in the room.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree. We've been thinking about this a lot as we iterate our digital strategy. And for me, kind of 3 things keep bubbling to the surface. The first one is that focus on customer, relentless focus on customer. The second is having that kind of vision, that where are we going, and people being excited about where we're going, and everyone going in the same direction. And the third is, and you touched on this, risk, is are we willing to take risk? Are we willing to create organizations and situations where we're comfortable with failure? And I'm not surprised, actually, with the number of hands that went up. I think we've got a lot more to do before we're truly there.
Well, on that, I guess, the next logical question then from that is, what do you think are those kind of stubborn barriers to innovation? And Alex touched on some of these, but obviously there is a sense in the room that there are still constraints to being innovative. So again, Sapna, I'm going to come to you. What do you think are the biggest barriers that you see in your kind of day-to-day work across the civil service?
It's quite a few.
Yeah.
And the sort of the surveys that we've done and the NAO's reports that have come out on innovation support, kind of what we just saw in terms of hands. So both on the individual level, people feel like their leaders aren't supportive of them in terms of giving them cover, taking risk. And then second, in terms of institutions, are we systematically set up to innovate? Probably not. So I think the NAO said that 3/4 of our institutions were not supportive of innovation. And I suppose in terms of some of those barriers, I think that it is our funding cycles and political cycles. Often innovation needs a longer runway, and we don't always have that. Second, we often do policy focused on, we say what the process is going to be instead of committing to an outcome and allowing ourselves the space to experiment. Evaluation is now, although we're trying to push this much harder, is not commonplace. So, and I mean evaluation in the sort of the randomized control trial style way, but also in the sort of the rapid fire, trying to understand our customer. It's not, in certain bits of government, it's completely commonplace, and in some places not. And that's to do with, I think, also about skills, support to uncover feedback, and our risk tolerance. What do we do if we get lots of bad feedback? Is that a really exposing thing? For us, it should be an asset to get this negative feedback so we can change. And if you work in a technology company, that's how you feel about the feedback. In government, I think that we often feel quite exposed, and it's that exposure that makes us sort of pull back.
Is it that kind of fear factor that Alex was talking about?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, thanks, Sapna. Gina, I'm going to come to you and then we'll come to the Singapore perspective, but do you recognise a lot of what Sapna is saying there in terms of the barriers that still exist?
I do, yes, and I think just starting from that risk, willingness to take risk or risk tolerance, I think that we are incentivised not to take risk, right? So there's a sort of fear factor, but I think if you look at the way that we're incentivised in public sector versus the way that I was incentivised when I was in private sector. I was incentivised to take risk. I was incentivised to innovate. I was incentivised to make things more efficient or to change things. And I don't think that we are here. So I think that's important. I think in terms of funding cycles and political cycles, I think that makes us think in the shorter term than we should be, and that we need to be being truly innovative, particularly, we're large complex organisations. It's not like we can change things overnight. Things take time. But I do also think that we sometimes can use some of those things as excuses, right? So it's, but I can't think beyond that because I don't have money beyond that. It doesn't mean you can't think beyond that, right? So I think that I see that quite a lot. And then the last thing is, I don't think that we all said kind of, an innovative organisation really focuses on their customers or their users. I don't think that we do enough. And I don't think, especially when you start to look kind of at those roles that are further removed from our end users, I don't think that they spend enough time understanding those end users and what those end users really need and want.
You mentioned that you felt more incentivised in the private sector than you do in the public sector. What did that look like? Are you talking financial incentives? Because obviously that's quite difficult in the public sector to put in place. Was there other kind of incentives in place?
So it was in part financial, but it was more cultural. It was more kind of, you did well in your performance conversation if you had genuinely been driving change, rather than if you had genuinely managed some risk and made sure that we didn't look bad in the press or whatever else it might be. So it was much more than financial incentives. I think it was definitely kind of more embedded into the culture of those organisations.
Thanks. Ping Soon, you said there's still more to be done. What are the barriers that you see still in place across the Singaporean civil service?
I think all government around the world is the same, so listening to what they say, and we are talking to a whole room of civil servants, so what is the color of the tape we use very well in government to string things together, right? So red tape, right? So bureaucracy is indeed one of the things that's inhibiting innovation. But in a way, I think sometimes we give bureaucracy a bad name. The reality is that in dealing with the masses and with the public, what the world we do in the public service, there's a need to standardize things, right? Because you want to remove the exception handling. So standard SOPs are needed. But at the same time, I agree with Sapna's point that a lot of time we are just hiding behind this cloak of bureaucracy as a reason for us not to innovate. And sometimes we say that that's because we need to be fair and transparent and all that, and we start to talk about, using to be fair to the procurement, right, to have the 3 codes and all that. And we kind of use that as a reason to not innovate because we say that we've got to respect that. And then sometimes we also hide behind the cloak to say we need public accountability, and therefore we need to be very prudent in spending. And the reality is, it's true, but there ought to be some space for some of this innovation to happen. But at the same time, I suppose we put ourselves at a very high bar. I'm not sure what's the situation in the UK. In Singapore, the government prides ourselves to be very competent, and when you start to take risks, sometimes things may not work out. So what happens if that particular experiment you don't work out? There's going to be a certain political price. Are you prepared to pay that political price? Have you socialized your public, the larger citizenry, that you're actually trying things? Must everything that you launch be like the final product? Are members of the public recognize it's actually an experiment and it may well fail and it may not continue? Must every pilot go on to be full-fledged? So you've got to start to have that culture, not just within the government, but kind of sending the public message to the citizenry that actually we are trying out some of these things. Don't hold us to accountability in a way if it didn't work out, as long as the money is spent wisely. So I think bureaucracy is one big part. The second barrier is, I think, some of the points that Gina talked about, which is a culture. I absolutely agree that the risk-reward equation is just not calibrated the right way. I wanted to ask those individuals that raised their hand. Your question was, have you done something and you failed? I'm going to ask all those who raised their hand, are you being promoted in your job? If you are, good, right? I made quite a lot of mistakes. I think I'm still in the job, so I will move on at some point in time. But that's the idea. Are you being rewarded to take some of this risk? I think by and large, public service, you're not being rewarded to do that, right? It's better to just continue. If ain't broken, why kind of fix it? So how can we create a culture that actually supports that? The third one, in terms of barriers, and I wanted to mention, is that it's both a feature of why public service do things very well, but it's also the weakness when you do it too well, which is the way we organize ourselves, right? For specialization, we are literally organized in every silos. We have a department to solve this problem, to solve that problem, and all that. But we all know innovation is bringing about 2 things separately and making new things. And some of these intersections across discipline is actually what creates innovation. So how often do we bring multidisciplinary team together? And I'm not even talking about across ministry. Ask yourself in your own ministries, where is your digital team? Are they order takers that's very low down the value chain where you just decide something and get them to do? Are your IT teams on the leadership table? If you're not bringing the technical expertise all the way up in front early on in policy making, in designing the ops, how are you going to get the innovation and leverage technology? How can IT not be an order taker, but one that actually create a solution and journey with the policy and ops people to think about new ways of solving things? So we need to start to break the silos across the ministry and start to break the silo within an agency.
Thanks, Ping Soong.
I think Sapna
we'll
wanted to add.
definitely be talking about some of those issues in the sessions today. Yes, Sapna.
Sorry, I just wanted to follow up on that point and ask you a question back. So I think that there's incredible innovation going on across the UK government. I'm sure the same in the Singaporean government. But the thing that I think we struggle with is scaling. So there's thousands of brilliant things going on, but to get it to scale or to learn the lessons from that project into another, I think is very difficult. Do you think that what you're describing about sort of breaking down the silos would be one way to see more scaling in the public sector?
I certainly do. I think breaking down the silos across the agency, across the ministries, helps to do things in a more scalable manner because it starts to engender greater ownership. The more people which are involved, I think the greater ownership in engendering to make sure that it succeeds. But another way to ensure scaling, at least what we do in Singapore, is, as I've said, innovation has to be a disciplined commitment process. So even in the funding cycles, So what we do is that we have a funneling process. So we make sure we set aside a pocket of funds, but not the whole funds are released at one go. So we start with a white space project, anything less than 50,000 Sing, which is probably about 30,000 pounds. Within 3 months, at a director level, at a civil service, you can kind of just approve and let it go. 250,000, 180,000 pounds, 6 months, somebody at the senior director can kind of sign off. So we go through this funneling process, and if you clear that through, you can go for a project about $1 million to $2 million. Okay, I'm just trying to convert. So just leave it about 2 million Singapore dollars for about a year, and that's what I can sign off at the initiation budget. But for each of these projects that go through, let's be very clear. And you've got to go through that whole design thinking process, right? What is the problem you're trying to solve? What's so novel about it? How do you define success? What are the metrics? And we make sure that we assemble panels that actually give a green light, a thumbs up, or thumbs down at every stage of the way before more funds are being released. So I think we can, at least in Singapore, we try to institute such a process to go through so that the innovation that we can do can actually spiral up. But there is a problem. Some of this innovation happens within the public service if it's public servants working together. Now, when you start to try to bring suppliers into the picture, it gets a bit complicated, right? So how do you actually design a process that allow you to bring in private sector early in the proof of concept, but yet provide an opportunity for them to spiral on a large-scale procurement? I don't think we've navigated it very well, because I think for government, we say that we can bring in private companies for experimentation, but we always get a bit wary when you're talking about a national scale system, because we've got to make sure it's open, it's fair, it's transparent, it's value for money, and why should the company that you work with for the POC be given a national-wide contract? So we need to still find a way to cross that, and if we can cross that, I think that ability to scale from a POC to a national solution will be much easier.
Gina, you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah, it's just a couple of thoughts based on this conversation. So yes, I agree scalability is a problem, but your point on silos, I see it across, just the Ministry of Justice, small organisation, not a small organisation at all, right? Lots of organisations under one banner. And, if we're thinking about being more digital, how do I, and having a focus on customer or user in our case, how do we keep that focus on a user if I can't track them between a police station, a court, a prison, probation, and back out into the public, right? So there's something about that join up that's really quite difficult across those silos, but also important across those silos to actually be able to truly, to truly deliver transformation. And your point on procurement, and I know we've got sessions on this, and there are examples of good and innovative things happening in that space. But if I generalise, I saw Cinch, the used car company, talk at a conference last year, and they were saying that they went from idea to listed on the New York Stock Exchange as a unicorn company in 14 months, right? It takes us longer to procure things than that. And that's not, how are we supposed to be innovative when that is kind of what we're faced with? So I think we need to really be tackling some of those cross-cutting problems.
But on that note then, and talking of breaking down silos, how can the public sector get better at working with and learning from the private sector in terms of good innovation?
We should speak to people with private sector experience.
Yeah, Gina, I'm coming back to you on this.
Look, I was saying this before we came on. I did a leadership training course, and I was sent on to shadow someone at Tesco, a leader at Tesco. And the thing that struck me about every single person that I met was their complete and utter obsession with their customers, right? Everybody, it didn't matter what role they were in, it didn't matter if they were working in IT, or if they were working in procurement, or if they were the person that was, deciding where things are put in a store. Every single person understood their customers, and every single decision that they made, they could relate to that customer. I'm buying this packaging, how's the customer going to feel about that? I'm doing this particular thing, how's the customer going to feel about that? How's that going to be interpreted? And that, for me, is the kind of...
But should we have more initiatives, for example, where we could have civil servants doing secondments in the private sector? Are there initiatives like that underway? And should we have more of them?
Yeah, absolutely. So as part of the 2021 Declaration on Government Reform, so it's our cross-cutting transformation programme, there was a big focus on how do we get more porosity between the private and public sector and third sector. We have a secondment scheme, and I think that we just need to focus on that more, both in kind of general skills, but also in technology and digital. But we need to make sure that there's the incentives in place for people to go out and do those things. So when they come back, one, that we're really learning from their experience, but two, they're rewarded for taking a risk, and that's seen to be additive to their experience. We actually have quite a lot of people on secondment, but I think that our focus in the next few years is to push that much further.
Yeah. Ping Sung, do you have schemes in Singapore where there's kind of exchange schemes between the public and private sector?
Absolutely. I think the porosity, allowing the porosity of talent between the private to the public and both ways are pretty important. But you've got to do it in a very systematic manner. So in GovTech, we actually run a Smart Nations Fellow program, where we take individuals from the private sector with pretty deep engineering capabilities and kind of sell them on the purpose. We can't pay them as competitively, but sell them on the purpose, right? Kind of bring them in. But back to what I said, it's not just about the purpose. You've got to, in that conversation, kind of define broadly what kind of skill sets they can bring and what is the broad categories of problems that they can work on. When we bring them in, how do you hack the red tape, right? So we kind of partner this Smart Nation Fellow with a bureaucracy hacker. Somebody who's good at the SOPs, somebody who's good at writing funding papers to kind of manage the procurement. And more importantly, it's not just a bureaucracy hacker, but somebody who can make the right connections for that person. Because he needs to know who to talk to understand the problem, to get the funding, to get the support, how to put together a presentation deck that has to go through 10 times before you get certain approval if you need to, all the way to the permanent secretary. So sort of bureaucracy hacker. And then give him some resources. And that has worked very well for us because there are people who come in. Some of them come in and then they work on some of this autonomous robot technology that we actually used during COVID. And after 9 months, they brought the project to a certain fruition. We give them to build a team. They left. And actually, they took the whole team out and formed a startup. Do I do something? I do. But over that 9 months period, I benefited from it. And each of these Smart Nation Fellows today, they may not be with us in the organization, but they still contribute. Where do they contribute in? They are mentors to my development teams. They help me in curating programs to upskill my officers in different fields of discipline, and they continue to play on my advisory board. So we need to do that. And similarly, in the public sector, we send officers to the Googles, the AWS and all that, to be attached to in some of their departments to allow that flow of ideas.
Again, I'm interested, sorry, Sapna, I will come to you. I'm just interested in the audience, how many of you would welcome and embrace a kind of opportunity to spend a year or 2 years in a private sector organisation? Yeah, there's quite a lot of interest in there. Sapna, you wanted to come in.
Brilliant. No, that's very exciting. I was thinking about a couple more initiatives that to support this sort of interchange. Other things that we've put in place in the last year and a half. External by default for senior civil service recruitment. So we're trying to encourage more people from non-civil service backgrounds to come and join the civil service on a permanent basis. And so now all senior civil service jobs have to be advertised externally unless there's a particular reason which needs special sign-off. And the second thing is that we're trying to bring in on special schemes innovators. So we have the number 10 Innovation Fellows Programme, which is quite small scale to put people that are interested in sort of having impact in government in various departments. But to your point, Ping, that it's not just about solving a problem, it's also working with a team to build up their skills.
I think we can push the idea further, right? Why should that porosity and exchange be between public and private sector, but between governments? So I'm actually in UK and Singapore government. My organization actually have an MOU with UK GDS. I think Tom is coming this afternoon. So it looks like we're all trying to solve the same problems, right? I think UK, at least under GDS, is making a big push to redesign many of the citizen services around the life moment. And that's a similar journey that we are on. UK is implementing one lock-in, I believe that's what you call.
Yeah.
And Singapore, we have our own, we call it SingPass. So these are projects that are being embarked between the two on both sides, which which are great opportunities for both teams to be seconded over to each other. So there's an open invitation, for UK GDS to send somebody over, and I've shamelessly asked Tom to allow opportunities for my UX designer, my product manager, to spend some time UK GDS, not to understand the content matter, but to understand the method of how you do things, both in terms of designing a login as well as the whole life journey approach in the designing services. So I think that would actually help. That porosity will help us improve our practices. And I always tell my counterparts in the public service across the world that in this field of designing better services for our citizens, we are not competing with each other.
Yeah.
Our competitors who keep raising the bar are the private companies. And our citizens will increasingly demand that sort of service they expect, right, in the private sector from the government as well.
So if you want to spend some time in Singapore, you can catch up with Ping Soon in the coffee break. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I don't want to leave this on the kind of note that, public sector isn't as good as the private sector in some of this, and we are busting some of those myths. So I just want to ask a final kind of question to all of you, which is, could you give me, maybe in the time that we've got, just one example of where there is great kind of practice going on in innovation where you currently sit? Ping Soon, I'm going to come to you first.
Actually, I think all governments during the COVID is one big period of innovation. And I'll just give you a quick one in Singapore, right? So in Singapore, my agency was tasked to mount a digital response to COVID. So we came up with the Trace Together, which is a Bluetooth-based proximity app. From the ideation to worldwide launch, it just took us 10 weeks. And it all happened because one of my directors who manages a tribe came to me during the start of COVID and said, I got this idea, can it work? I said, well, we are all fighting a crisis, but if you think you have time and you have some resources, go and try it out. After the long story, it's a short story of that, right? It's in 8 weeks' time, we mount together a response, right? And we've got to clear many stages. We've got to convince the Apple and the Google to allow the app to be posted on the store. We need to spend time talking to the contact tracers to understand how they actually do contact tracing and so on and so forth. But that spirit of innovation didn't stop with just a Trace Together app, because we got to address the digital inclusion issue. So we went to develop a hardware-based token to allow people who have no smartphone to do that. And then we supplemented, right, by integrating a national check-in system to allow the Trace Together to be linked with the check-in system. So they can use your phone to check in by scanning the QR code or do a tap and go, right? And then we realized that the pandemic takes so long and we got to kind of replace the battery in the hardware device. And we worked with private sector to design a vending machine. So instead of getting Coke or drinks out of that, you can get a replacement Trace Together token. So what I'm trying to say is that this whole experience that we went through, at least in Singapore, demonstrated a couple of things, right? It demonstrated the importance of putting multidisciplinary team together. It's not just the technologies. We work with the Ministry of Health. We work with the private sector because they know the supply chain better, UX designer, product managers, and so on and so forth. And it's to take that iterative approach, right? To understand the user, understand what's being done, and kind of do a quick prototyping. And it also requires, and thankfully, supportive leaders in Singapore that's prepared to take the risk and kind of try it out. Yeah.
Thank you. Gina, an example from you.
So an example of where we've delivered something for a user, we've rolled out in-cell technology to 15 prisons now. So that means offenders have got a device, a secure device, in their cell that allows them to do their own administration. It's a platform for education. And opens lots of doors for us in terms of other things that we can then build on. And for me, that was a great example because we had a clear purpose that was based on the user. We took more risk than we usually would, giving offenders devices. And we had multidisciplinary teams come together to deliver that. And that has made a huge difference to the level of engagement of those people, many of whom can't read or write and therefore couldn't engage with the paper-based regime. So that's our kind of best example of user-facing. And then just one, I know we're running out of time, but just really quickly, one of the things that we discovered last November, we did an innovation kind of campaign month. Because one of the things that we came across was that people didn't understand the art of the possible, couldn't think about, how... We're struggling with how might we do things differently. So we brought people from other countries, we brought people from private sector, we brought a robot dog and some VR into the offices just to get people thinking differently. So to Ping Soon's point about process, you need to be able to help people to just think differently in order to innovate.
Thanks, Gina. Sapna, we are minus 10 seconds, so
Okay.
over to you for the final thoughts.
No pressure. So I think that just to go back to the point I made earlier, there's great innovation going on across government, but I think that we do a poor job of celebrating it and rewarding people for their great ideas. So over the last 18 months or so, we've launched a data challenge, and the Civil Service Awards now have an innovation award. And I think that these things are really important. Do look up the winners from last year's data challenge. The Peatlands drainage team won. It's a very cool idea. It will have a lot of impact when it's implemented. And I think that we need to tell these stories of innovators that exist in the public sector. Someone shared some great research with me a few weeks ago that innovators need to be told that they're innovators. If you think that you're an innovator, you do better work, you have more impact. And I think that we do people down in the public sector by telling them that we're not innovative. We need to change that narrative.
Thank you so much to all of you. I mean, I took away from that taking more risks, building multidisciplinary teams, learning from each other, and confidence that you are all innovators. I'm sure you will join me in saying a huge thank you to Gina, to Ping Soon, and to Sapna. Thank you so much. We will exit the stage.